You're live.
Good evening, everyone. It is 6:03 and we are live.
Madam Clerk, I'd like to call to order the City Commission Budget Work Session number 4 and have you call the roll.
Okay, Mayor Pam Triolo is not here tonight. Her father is ill and she's with him. Vice Mayor Andy Amoroso.
Here.
Commissioner Scott Maxwell. You're muted, but Commissioner Maxwell is here.
I'm here.
Commissioner Omari Hardy is going to be a little bit late. And Commissioner Herman Robinson.
Here.
Thank you.
And Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner Robinson.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we'll jump right in. Tonight we have Stantec going to do an introduction and broad overview. To start, who's going to actually start with Stantec?
Well, if you want, I'll do a brief introduction if it's all right.
Okay, go ahead, Bruce.
All right, thank you, sir. Yes, Bruce Miller, Finance Director for the record. Just to give you a little bit of background, as you know, we've been going through the budget processes. This is the 4th presentation of the budget. We're at a point now where the budgets are essentially balanced, which took a lot of work between the last presentation and today. And we're working with Stantec to do the long-term, excuse me, the long-term projections, the sensitivity analysis, which are so great doing. The nice thing also is that the preliminary capital program is embedded in the in their projections, which gives us some good analysis on future debt service. That being said, I'd like to introduce David Hyder. David is new to the account. He's been with Stantec for a while now. I've had good fortune working with him in Annapolis. So I'm very, very happy to have him part of the Lake Worth Beach team. Letitia, who you know, and then Jacob Silence. So I feel very, very comfortable that the numbers, we have scrubbed the numbers. So with that, I'll turn it over to David and he can run it from here. Thank you very much.
David, real quick,
Yes.
A quick question. So I'm going to ask the commissioners to wait until you're finished with any of the presentations that you're going to do before we start asking questions. But do we have the ability to jump around on your screens like we usually do when we're at City Hall? Do we have that ability with the Zoom meeting?
We do. Yep.
Okay, so everything's pretty much the same when we meet with you. Thank you.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. Just we'll go through the presentation and then we can pull up the models and do the live demos to run any scenarios. Yep.
Keith, real quick, David and team,
Sure.
if you don't mind, I know if we get into a questioning scenario, we do typically like to see all screens and the gallery view. So if you can pause your presentation for just a moment so they can discuss and then resume.
Perfect. Sounds good. And I'll get started. Bruce, I appreciate that introduction. It's good to work with you again, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be part of the team this year. We do have a presentation. I'm going to ask Jacob to pull that up so that we can start going through, and I'm going to stop my video so that I don't have to see myself talking to myself. And once the screen comes up, we can get started. All right, perfect. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, so we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump right in. Jacob, if you can take us to the agenda. So what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to provide a little bit of background just in terms of the overall process that we've gone through. Want to hit some of the key factors that are really impacting the modeling that we're doing this year. Then we'll give you a snapshot of each of the 7 funds And then as the Vice Mayor alluded to, at the end, we will go through some Q&A where we can look at some live modeling. So to give you that background in terms of the overall process, on the next slide, our integrated financial sustainability process that we've been part of for a number of years now really consists of three main items. So that first item is maintaining and developing forecasting financial forecasts for each of the funds. So we have cash flow models for each of the funds, and those cash flow models are influenced obviously by customer demands, property assumptions, the actuals and projected budgets, and then we project out actually over a 10-year period. We'll be talking this evening about a 5-year look ahead. The models include your operating costs, your capital cost, and any R&R related expenditures. The benefit of these models, obviously, is the fact that we can run scenarios and do sensitivity analysis to see what impacts there are in terms of additional capital funding, what happens if we see slower growth, what if we change a rate, things of that sort. And then we can validate those assumptions based on looking to see if you're meeting your targets. So are we meeting our debt service coverage requirements? We have specific reserve targets for each of the funds. And since the funds are interrelated, we do have the impacts that you have amongst the funds as you make changes to an individual fund. And ultimately, this process allows us to develop a long-term financial plan. We realize that changes today do have impacts to the future, so it allows us to evaluate what type of capital can we execute, what do we potentially need to do today to rates to make sure that we're meeting our targets, and ultimately, what are the impacts to your to the citizens and businesses of Lake Worth Beach. That's kind of the framework. Next slide has some of the key factors that are really impacting our analysis this year. The first one is obvious. COVID-19, the pandemic, has certainly impacted your revenues in the current fiscal year. And we'll talk about how that's impacted some of the funds. Unfortunately, we know that that's going to linger into next year. Hopefully not for as long as it's been this year, but we do know that that's going to continue to have some impacts. One of the items that we'll talk a lot about tonight is the fact that the city has secured new bond proceeds. So you issued the 2020 A and B non-ad valorem revenue bonds this summer. And what that did was it provided the city with $26 million in bond proceeds. And there's really two functions for those proceeds. Series A provided $10 million for capital projects, both current and future capital projects for your electric, sewer, stormwater, and refuse funds. And then the balance, the 2020 Series B, really provides liquidity for your other funds. So $16 million contribution to working capital. And that really has a big impact, as we'll see as we go through tonight. So that impacts the general fund, beach, electric, water, sewer, and stormwater. So that has happened. The last item has yet to happen, and that's the restructuring of your existing debt. So we've been working with the city's financial advisor, Davenport and Company, and they've provided us with some estimated restructured debt for your water, electric, and general fund. We're anticipating that restructuring would take place in the next fiscal year in 21. And what that does is it reduces the obligations or the annual cash outflows to some of the funds where you do the restructuring over the next couple of years and frees up some cash flow. And that's anticipated to happen in concert with a new revenue bond issue for the utilities. So for water, sewer, and electric. So those really are the key items, and you'll see as we go through each of the funds how those these items impact each. So the first one is the beach fund, and the beach fund certainly has been impacted by COVID. We're estimating that parking revenues, which is the primary revenue for the beach fund, will be down about $630,000 in the current fiscal year. We're estimating that that's going to be about half of that will happen next year, so about $300,000 in 21. And so that obviously has a negative impact on the beach fund. And real minor impact is that some lease revenues are not going to come in the current fiscal year, but they'll come in next year in 2021. But the biggest impact of the beach fund, and this is to take a little bit time to explain here because it's has such a big impact, is that with the 2020 Series B bonds, the beach fund is receiving $5.48 million. And that $5.48 million is going to serve really two purposes. One, it's going to pay off the loans that the water, insurance, and capital funds had loaned to the beach fund. So of that 5.48 million, 4.35 million is going to be paid back to the water, insurance, and capital funds. So that obligation is no longer there to those other funds. And then the delta between that, between the 5.48 and the 4.35, so a little over $1 million, goes into the balance for the beach fund, which helps the working capital. That debt service will have to be paid off by the beach fund. So over the next 20 years, it's about $386,000 in annual debt service. So what this looks like, if we go on to the next slide, and this is the panel from the beach fund model. And I'll just take a real brief minute to go through. We'll be looking at panels for all of the funds. Up at the top of the panel, we have the typical revenue adjustment factor. For the beach fund, it's the metered parking rate. Below that, we have some statistics in terms of the cash flow, the cash balance within the funds. And then we have the graphics down below, which show the working capital, our revenues and expenditures, any CIP, and then the various expenditures. So a couple of things to note on the beach fund, as I mentioned, given those bond proceeds at the end of fiscal year 19, essentially beginning fiscal year 20, we now have a cash balance that's positive in the beach fund. And that's because of those bond proceeds, even after paying back the water, insurance, and capital funds. So you're a little over $2 million in cash balance there. And then we're projecting that cash balance will stay right around that value over the projection period. So you're well within your 2-month target. The only caveat to that is that we are assuming that there's a 50-cent increase in the parking rate occurring in 2022. And we're doing that just to keep our revenues and expenditures in alignment. Obviously, you have the ability to evaluate that next year. So we're not proposing any type of adjustment this year. Last item is just that talking with staff, we are including $200,000 on an annual basis beginning in 2022 for repair and replacement type work within the beach fund. And so this forecast here factors those costs in. Okay, so that's the beach fund. Next is refuse. Refuse has not really been impacted by COVID-19. In fact, we're seeing higher revenues in 2020 and 2021 in comparison to what we were forecasting last year. And a couple of reasons for that. One is that 19 revenues came in higher than estimated or projected, which then boosts the 2020 revenues. And then the city anticipates increasing the solid waste fee or the refuse fee by 5% in fiscal year 21. So that increases revenues a little bit more. Your O&M and capital expenditures are pretty much steady with where we were looking at before. And this fund didn't get any reimbursement, but from the Series 2020A, you are getting about $525,000 worth of funds to pay for capital within the refuse fund. And that turns into debt service of about $40,000 a year. So the panel for the refuse, as I mentioned up at the top, there's a 5% increase in the solid waste fee. That brings the single family residential bill from $233 a year up to $245. As you can see, the results down at the bottom in terms of the revenues, the reserves, very solid in terms of your reserve levels are well above the target, above the 4-month target. They're increasing a little bit because our cash in and cash out, you have a little bit more cash in than cash out. That does tick over in 2024, but overall, with that 5% increase, things look very solid within the refuse fund. On the next slide, we have just a comparison where you are today. $233 for the refuse fee would go to $245 this next fiscal year. Puts you in the kind of the middle to lower end of the grouping here with the comparison municipalities in the county. It's important to note that this does not include the $185 disposal fee that's paid to Palm Beach County for most of these jurisdictions. This is really just the collection fee. Okay, next we'll talk about the general fund. So general fund has certainly been impacted, like most communities, by COVID-19, estimating lower revenues by about 1.6 million in 2020, thinking it'll be about $1 million in 2021. So that certainly has an impact. Working with Bruce as part of the budget process, the revenue reductions have been somewhat offset by appropriately aligning the interfund allocations between the funds. So that helps to some degree. And in terms of similar to the beach fund, the general fund did receive a significant contribution to the working capital from the Series B bonds. So about $5 million is going into working capital, and that turns into about $340,000 per year in annual debt service for the general fund. And then finally, the Davenport Company did provide some restructured debt for the general fund, which reduces the annual debt payments a little bit for the Siemens debt. So in terms of the panel for the general fund, there's no assumed changes in the millage rates, as you can see up at the top. Taxable value increases are pretty conservative at this point, tailing off a little bit. I know they've been higher in the past couple of years. And what we're showing is that some positive cash flow in the next 2 years, and then we begin to see some potential shortfalls beginning in 2023. As I mentioned, the contribution from the bond proceeds of $5 million really helps the working capital balance. So you're well above that 2-month target. And we're forecasting, without any changes in the millage rates, that you'll stay above that target until 2025. So a lot can obviously change between now and then. Okay. So local sewer. Local sewer, last year we had talked about having a 15% increase needed in fiscal year 21. What we're projecting and needing this year is 7.5. So we believe you can cut that increase in half. The sewer fund did receive some contribution to working capital, small amount, $334,000. It turns into a little bit of debt service. And then you do have some capital borrowing that's planned in the future. You've got about $8.2 million worth of CIP over the next 5 years, which would turn into about $475,000 in debt. So if we look at the panel, what we're showing here, again, last year we talked about a 15% increase in the sewer rate. We're projecting a 7.5% is needed in the current this next fiscal year, followed by 3.25. And the primary reason for that, you can see down when we look at working capital, is that we're below our target right now. And so we're trying to work our way back up to meeting that target balance, which under this forecast, we would get there by 2022. So you can see there is some pretty significant capital that's planned for local sewer, about $8.1 million. And the plan is that the majority of that would be borrowed for. Okay. So next fund is water fund. Similar to the sewer fund, we had anticipated an increase would be needed in fiscal year 21. We're based on the results. We're assuming that you don't need to do a rate increase this year for water. And part of that is because of the influx of cash. As I mentioned, you are receiving in the water fund from the beach fund, that loan's being paid off. So $2.6 million is coming in. You've also received that contribution to working capital of $3.1 million. So that's really helping the balance within the water fund. And then also assumed is that the existing BOA 2013 loan would be restructured. So Davenport has provided some restructuring debt. So that significantly lowers your debt service payments here in the near term and increases them in the future. Do have a fairly significant amount of borrowing, $15.3 million over the next 5 years. That would turn into about $800,000 worth of debt per year. So in terms of the results, again, no increase recommended for the current fiscal year. Future years, we're thinking maybe 3.75 would be necessary, but as you can see, we are building up some cash balance within the working capital fund. well above our target of 4 months. So this would be one we would want to continue to evaluate in future years. Part of the potential increase is because of the borrowing that's anticipated. So if we do that borrowing, we need to make sure that we're demonstrating that we have adequate debt service coverage to be able to meet that the borrowing requirements. But overall, the water fund looks very solid. So in terms of a comparison, this is water and sewer bills, where they are today for Lake Worth Beach for a typical residential customer using 5,000 gallons. Because of that recommended 7.5% increase in the sewer rate, you'd see that you'd slide to the right a little bit. It's always very important to emphasize, though, that these are current rates within these jurisdictions, so we don't necessarily know what they're going to do next year. So the fiscal 21 comparison is somewhat an apples and oranges comparison. So we need to keep that in mind. So a couple more funds. We've got the Stormwater Fund. So lower annual revenues are projected. Again, last year we were assuming a 5% increase in stormwater fees would be required. This year we're looking at no increase, and then going forward we're projecting that you don't need quite as significant increases as we talked about in the past. Part of that is the infusion of cash within the working capital fund from the Series B. We also have some capital project proceeds from the Series A, $2.3 million, which is helping to provide funds for capital. And then you do have some borrowing anticipated for the Stormwater Fund, $2.3 million. So if we look at the panel for stormwater, it looks, again, solid, similar to the water fund. No increase in 2021, potentially increases in the future years of 3% to keep your revenues and expenditures in alignment. But again, you're well above your 12-month target on the working capital fund. And we're projecting that with some modest increases, you'd stay at that position. I think we've got one more. Oh, nope, got the comparison. So where you are now, and obviously no increase is proposed for the stormwater fee, and then what the stormwater fees are for some other municipalities in the area. And then I believe our last fund is electric. So in terms of electric, we received a little bit in terms of a cash infusion for working capital, about $770,000, turns into a small loan payment. Did receive a little bit of capital for capital projects, $140,000. The big impacts, though, when we look at the panel, are really the last two here. Number 3 is the restructuring of the BOA debt that Davenport provided. That really frees up some pressure on the electric fund. So it pushes out some of that debt service to future years. So you can see that annual payments would be about $625,000 through 2043. And they would jump up in future years to 1.6 million as a result of the restructuring. But the real story on electric is obviously the CIP. Ed has provided a necessary CIP that includes $143 million worth of capital. And if you were to finance all of that, that turns into about $8.2 million worth of annual debt service. I know we are going to be working as we look at the new revenue bond issue with Davenport and Company in terms of what potential capital needs are and how they could potentially be stretched out a little bit further. So maybe that the full amount isn't borrowed in the short term. But in terms of the results, you can see here on the panel, we're assuming no changes in the electric rates, keeping those constant over the next 5 years. Given the cash infusion and the restructuring of debt, you can see that the working capital fund balance actually grows over the next couple of years. And that really is helped by that restructuring of debt. So you have your cash in is a little bit higher than your cash out. We are showing that as we start having to make some debt service payments in the future, there are some cash shortfalls beginning in 24 and 25. But as I mentioned, the real story is the significant CIP that's necessary for electric. And so the final slide is just to show the electric rates where you are currently today. Fiscal year 2020 monthly residential bill, right in the middle of the pack at $108, say. And obviously no change given the lack of a recommendation for increases in electric rates. So with that, we will now jump into models, and happy to take any questions, and I will stop talking so much.
Okay, thank you very much. At this time, I don't see any hands up from my other electeds, so I'm going to jump in. I can't remember what panel it was, but it was before the sewer. The panel before the sewer. And
That'd be
we
the
had
general
some,
fund. Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay. So we had some issues
Nope.
starting maybe in 23, 24. Do we know what those issues are? What are we doing to cause that dip?
Well, yeah, it's essentially as your expenditures grow. So if you look at the graph that has revenues versus expenditures, right now, we forecast an increase in the taxable value. So that's what's driving those revenues to the large extent. So that's the black line. And the trajectory on the orange line, which is the cash out, given your personnel and things of that sort, is expected to grow at a faster rate than we're anticipating revenues to come in.
Okay.
But it's real important to emphasize that you need to look at this every year, and that those trajectories are, subject to change. I do know that personnel is the primary driver, I believe, within the general fund. But that's really what's driving it.
Okay, thank you. And the beach fund, parking. There was a recommendation for a 50-cent increase in 2022. Why are we looking at 2022 instead of 2021? Would we, wouldn't we want to try to get ahead with everything that's going on? We got lucky so far with hurricane season, but it's not over yet. Unfortunately, we're still in the middle of a pandemic and doesn't know what that looks like. Why was there a recommendation for 22 instead of 21?
Primary reason was because we were showing, even with the assumption on the COVID impacts in 21, that you were going to generate a little bit of a positive cash balance. And we really saw, when we were looking at our projections of revenues versus expenditures, that it was 2022 when we started to see those expenditures creep up higher than our revenues. So you certainly could. It wouldn't.
Wouldn't we want to try to get ahead of it instead of catching up with it?
You could, but it would be conservative to do that. I guess the alternative to that is the fact that you do have adequate working capital. You're above your target, and so even if you were to see even just a flat revenues and expenditures matching, no surplus, that you'd still be in a solid position. But I never advocate against raising fees if that's what's desired, or if that's what's deemed appropriate. We don't think you necessarily potentially need it. I will say that it is very difficult for us to forecast what the impacts of COVID are going to be. If I could do that, I should probably be in a different business. But but I appreciate your thoughts. It's not a bad consideration.
I see no hands. Commissioner Robinson, did you have any questions at this time?
Yeah, well, I don't know how far we're going to get into it, but your question, I know a lot of us are interested in payback, at least on the commission. Payback's important. And when we see no raises in 2021 in a couple of the line items, I would rather spread it out, like you said, a little at a time, and rather than see zero on some of those items in 2021. We can kick it down the road, but if we start early, we don't have to play catch up so hard at the end. And the FP&L line, they're going to raise rates. And hopefully they'll raise it to our line. Do you think that's possible? 96 to 107? Anyhow.
Vice
Ed,
Mayor. Yeah, Vice Mayor, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay,
So
so
the
let me address
question
that.
was jumping from 96.43 to our 107.99. If their rate, the proposed rate increase that FP&L is looking to do right now, would that fill that gap in your opinion? What are they looking to do at this time?
Well, a couple of things that in response, Vice Mayor. The first one is that we don't know what FPL's rate increase will be to their customers. We know that they are raising their transmission costs. We are bearing that impact already, and their customers are bearing that impact. To the extent that that's going to change their distribution costs, we don't know yet. So we don't know what they're going to ask for. Although we know what they've said publicly, that they're going to come and ask for a rate increase. The second thing I would point out is that please take these numbers with a grain of salt, because these are not the numbers that you would see on the bottom line of your bill. So for example, if you look at our number of 107.99, let's call that 108 in the FPL number, and do the math, is that looks like better than an 11% difference. The true difference is about half of that. So we go by what's on the bottom line of the bill, the check you have to write, and we analyze this monthly. We compare a residential bill in the FPL system to a residential bill in the Lake Worth system. And there's only a 6.25% difference. So we need to take a look at these numbers. Quite often when these numbers are pulled, they're pulled from, for example, the FMEA or database, or from the State Public Service Commission database. And they don't always include all of the taxes that are applied to the bills that the customers get. So it's not a true apples to apples comparison. But we do know by looking at actual bills, checks people would have to write, FPL versus Lake Worth, there's only about a 6% difference. So that has to be looked at closer.
Yeah, that's the abuse you take by having one piece of paper instead of two. Even if they got two separate bills, it would lighten your remarks or other people's remarks. The other question was, you're talking now about 143 million. We were a couple months ago, we were talking 80 to 100 borrowing.
Yeah, Vice Mayor, if I may address that.
Yes, sir.
So the difference in the numbers is due to a few things. One is we've talked a lot about the funding of the SHRIP program, System Hardening Reliability Improvement, which includes distribution projects and transmission projects. In addition to that, there are other projects that are not related to system hardening and reliability improvement that are in our overall capital plan. Okay, so system hardening reliability goes out, 5-6 years or so, roughly maybe 7 years. But when you do a 10-year model, you have to model in the full 10 years. And what was done in the past was probably not correct, because it assumed that if the utility had not submitted capital spending for years, that then it must be zero. The reality is that it's not zero. So what you want to make sure when you're doing utility finance and planning, as a rough rule of thumb, and you adjust it as you get closer, is that your capital spend should be equal to or greater than your rate of depreciation, just as somewhere in that neighborhood. It would never be zero, but what's happened in Lake Worth Beach over a number of years is the capital spend dropped way down below depreciation levels. Basically, you're drawing the life out of the asset and not renewing it. So the dollars that you're seeing now in these front years of the plan is basically putting back into the system the money that was not put in over the last 20 years.
So,
building
what has changed from the estimate of 80 to 100 to 143?
I think I just explained it, that we added years where there were zeros in the prior plan. We added that.
Talking about all those expenditures in the 80 to 100 estimate.
That and a refinement of cost estimates on various projects, additional projects that have been added to the capital plan, and then we continue to adjust it. So what we do is we in the front year, for example, the current year, as we go out for bid on materials and project costs, and we look at the actual prices on an as-built basis, we then adjust using our experience for future years' projects. So some projects are going to cost more than we initially anticipated. We have projects that we did not anticipate having to do, and we plugged in the last 3 or 4 years at a little over $4 million a year, if I remember correctly, in the CIP, to account for capital that is not yet defined, but we know there will be projects, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now that will have to be done. So to really plan into the future, you should plug some number in there rather than just represent to the commission, the board, if you will, that it'll be zero. It won't be zero. There'll be something there.
Did that answer your question, Commissioner Robinson?
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like Commissioner Hardy has joined us and his hand is up. Commissioner Hardy, did you have a question?
Sure. While Ed's here, Ed, how much, I recognize that the utility this year was about to do $65-ish million in overall revenue. About how much of that is rate revenue?
No, we were not, it was not about 65, Commissioner Hardy. It was closer to 61, and we'll come in around 58. I don't remember we ever had it up around
in previous presentations, you projected around 64 or 65 billion dollars. But okay, so you said it's about 61 total revenue.
That's what the budget, if I remember correctly, that's what the budget was set at around 61. I could go back and reconfirm that, but I believe that's what the fiscal year budget was set at. And we're projecting, I believe, to come in around 58, 59. I don't want to turn off my panel here right now to go look for it, but I think if Bruce might be able to take a quick look and reconfirm that, but he would have it.
If I may, total sources of funds for fiscal year 20 were budgeted at 61.5. Fiscal year 21, the projection is at 62.3.
Okay.
The fees, if you will, are at 61 fiscal year 21, and then 60 for fiscal year 20.
Okay, so about how much of that is rate revenue?
The rate revenue is the 61,000. I mean, the 61 million versus 60 million.
All of that is rate revenue.
Well, let me get to more of the detail, but
now, it's not, it might not be all rate revenue because we do have pole attachment revenues, late fees. We have revenues from the sale of gas capacity, things like that. So the vast majority
total
of
rate revenues are more like 53 million.
Okay.
So that would include capacity fees, fuel charges, and then all of the base and usage charges.
Thank you.
Okay. And not all of our customers, which if my memory serves me correct, the last time we spoke, I remember us saying that we had about 27,000 accounts. Not all of those accounts are residential accounts, right?
That's correct. We have around 27,300 accounts in rough numbers. And that moves up and down slightly every month, and they're not all residential. No.
Okay. And the gap that you were discussing between the bottom line, what folks would write a check to us every month, and what they would write a check to FPL for, the same amount of power, that you said, even though it looks, according to these published figures, to be somewhat substantial, you said the gap would be about, in reality, about 6% for residential customers?
To be very specific, 6.25. I track it personally every month. That's why looking at these numbers, it's very difficult because if you're collecting the data at the state level, at the FMEA or the Public Service Commission, taxes that are applied, for example, franchise fees are different in every single municipality around the state that FPO might operate in. So they typically report these numbers without taxes. So when you look at the 107.99, that for Lake Worth, that doesn't include it or includes things that are not included in the 94 or in the 9643. So this data needs to be updated because I see, for example, it shows Vero Beach here. Well, Vero Beach no longer has a utility. So so I need to understand where this data came from because we certainly have more current comparisons.
Yeah, so I guess I can speak to just what we have on FPL. So we took that out of the residential rates, fees and charges that they post on their website. But what Ed is saying is correct. So this doesn't include any of franchise fees or other fees that may be assessed at local levels. This is essentially the customer charge for FPL and then a usage charge of, I think, 62928. So it's essentially a base charge and a use charge taken straight out of FPL.com rates.
Right.
So we have to add a little bit more. We actually have employees who live in FPL territory who will share their bills with us. And we take a look at how many kilowatt hours they used. And we look at the check that they'd have to write to FPL. And we do the exact same thing in Lake Worth. And we compare these two. And it's about a 6.25% difference.
Okay. And is the gap between a residential and a commercial customer about the same on average here as that 6.25%, or would it be smaller or larger?
I believe the gap for commercial would be higher, meaning or larger, meaning a commercial customer in the Lake Worth territory is paying more than a commercial customer in an FPL territory. The exact comparisons are very difficult because we don't have the exact same rate classes and divisions of customers. And unfortunately, we don't have the ability to get a hold of FPL commercial customer bills and compare them to here, right? So unlike employees who may live in the FPL territory, we're willing to share their bills. It's very personal. We can do that comparison easy on residential, much more difficult to do on commercial. But we do know that our rates for commercial are higher than FPL's.
Okay, so if we're collecting about $53 million in rate revenue, some of that's residential, some of that's commercial. So if I were to say, well, that 6.25 gap would amount to about, $3.33 million that is coming out of the community to the city over what would come out of the community to the city, if we were charging FPL's rates, applying that 6.25% to the $53 million figure, that wouldn't really be accurate because the gap with commercial accounts is larger. And so that $3.33 million figure would probably be a little higher given the difference between what commercial ratepayers are paying here and residential ratepayers are paying.
Vice Mayor, if you'd like me to address that.
Yes, please.
So we've been through this before, and we've gone through it in great detail and explained that there are things in the that revenue to the electric utility that are used to pay for city services and support city services, such as shared services, such as contributions to general fund, such as various other activities. And that number is actually closer to about $8 million.
I'm saying ceteris paribus.
No, I'm gonna. It's about $8 million of utility revenues are transferred.
If I can refine my question, I'm asking ceteris paribus.
Hold on.
All other things being equal.
Commissioner Hardy, you asked a question. Let him finish his comments, and then if you'd like to update your question, feel free.
So yes, thank you, sir. It's very difficult to get into apples to apples comparisons because the funds, particularly the electric fund, I know other funds do this as well, and I'm not saying it's inappropriate at all, do support the activities of the city. So there are things that are recovered in electric bills that are then contributed up to the parent company, if you will, which is the city and the general fund, to help support other city activities. So it's a difficult apples to apples comparison that you're trying to make. Thank you.
Commissioner Hardy, did you have additional questions?
Yes. So ceteris paribus, meaning all other things being equal, nothing else changes. That 6.25 amount represents millions of dollars that are coming out of the community, specifically to the electric utility, that if we adopted a rate structure like FPL's, would not, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, no other changes being made.
I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement.
It's a question.
What I don't understand the question either. If you're trying to make hold on. If you're trying to make the statement that
I'm asking a question, sir.
Okay, please restate your question.
Sure. It is the same question that I asked, which he answered, but without the second, third order issues that he addressed, right? So he answered the question that I asked.
So you got the answer to your question. What more are you looking for?
Oh my gosh. This is
point of information.
Hold on one moment. Vice Mayor Pro Tem Maxwell.
Yes, we're in a budget meeting. I don't know what this line of questioning has anything to do with the budget. I think this is an interrogation, and it clearly is to create a narrative that the commissioner previously stated with respect to his willingness or desire, if you will, to offer the utility up for sale to FP&L. And we've already just decided as a commission, we're not going to have that conversation. So
hold on, Commissioner Hardy.
I think this line of question needs to cease unless it's, unless he has something to contribute to the budget process. I think his line of question needs to cease.
Okay, Commissioner Hardy, have you had conversations and/or meetings with any of the staff that are here tonight on any of your questions or any of your issues?
Are you talking one-on-one?
Correct. Have you met with any of the staff to get any of your questions answered?
Not this particular question.
Okay.
May I, the gentleman made a point of order.
Correct. Are you looking to, we're in budgets conversations. Are you looking to suggest that we lower utility rates at this time? What is your actual, where are you trying to go with this?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So yeah, I lament the fact that money is coming out of the city, specifically to the electric utility, basically to help us with our general fund budget.
To pay for services that we need in the city.
Sure. I mean, you could argue, for example, that these utility bills are a bit more regressive than property taxes. And so if you're talking about services being paid, if you want to take it there, there are obviously other ways to do it. Now, I'm asking the questions because Ed, I believe, went out of his way to note during the presentation that the gap as published is not the gap in reality. So I was exploring the issue.
Absolutely, and that is the truth.
I was exploring the issue that Ed himself raised. And what I was trying to get at, based on the issue that Ed himself raised about the gap, which no one brought up but Ed. So being as he raised it, I thought I would figure out and ask him what the overall aggregate impact of that gap is. That's what I'm trying to get at. And no one point of ordered Ed when he talked about the gap because folks thought it was relevant. And so I'm trying to get at what Ed brought up, and I'm just trying to figure out what it is in aggregate and not on a per bill basis.
Ed, at this time, I mean, I know that's out of the scope of what was on the agenda for tonight. Are you prepared to answer that question, or would you like to get back with us?
We can certainly get back, but I'll add a couple of comments. So first of all, I'm not aware of any dollars that are coming out of the community. Any dollar that goes to the electric utility goes back into the community. It's spent right here in this electric utility, and then transfers go into City Hall in general fund. So there's no dollars that I'm aware of that are coming out of the community being directed elsewhere. There's also a comment, and it may have been a misstatement, but that there were city dollars that were going into the electric utility. The electric utility is fully paying its own way and is generating excess cash to at least $8 million a year, which is going to the city. And then it has still been building fund balance, as you can see in the working capital number that have changed dramatically from last year. So this city's utility is in fact generating cash, and that cash is going into the community and being reinvested in the community in a form of capital investment to improve the reliability of this utility. So I'm not aware of any dollars that are leaving this community being taken out of the community and going someplace else.
Did you have a comment, sir?
Yeah, I should be clear. When I say the community, I mean the residents of the community, and going to, another matter. Look, I don't doubt that the utility generates cash flow. I obviously have a problem with us raising the extra revenue in this way. And, we've discussed this before. Ed mentioned the gap. Being as he mentioned it and no one made an issue of it, and it's not directly pertinent to our budget, I thought I would explore the issue and figure out what the gap is on an aggregate basis. If folks have problems with me exploring an issue that Ed raised in his previous comments, that's fine. On the revenue estimates for this year, my apologies. I just went back and looked from a presentation on May 26th that you gave us. You said that, your forecast for this year was about $63.9 million, which is about $64 million. So my apologies. Now, obviously, COVID has affected that, but that was where I was getting that figure from. I understand it wasn't budgeted, but it was based on us being ahead pre-COVID. So my apologies for that. I have some questions for our consultants, if you don't mind.
Hold on one moment, Commissioner. I would argue with you that I don't remember what words you used, but it kind of alluded to that we are, going out of our way to charge more to people. I will remind you that we have lowered rates for year after year after year. So we are indeed lowering rates on behalf of the customer. Can we do better? Absolutely. We're working on that. So moving on.
Mr. Chair?
Excuse me?
I didn't insinuate that we hadn't lowered rates. We can
you didn't mention it either. You acted like we were raping and pillaging residents.
Again, those are your words, not mine.
Absolutely, and those are my words. And we're going to move on now. So we'll in this conversation. And we're going to move on.
Questions of our consultants, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely, that's what we're going to move on. We're going to move on. I need to jump back for a moment to something Commissioner Robinson alluded to with our parking. We had talked about, maybe, changing that parking panel to look maybe 25 cents this year, 25 cents next year. I just wanted to put that on the record. Commissioner Hardy, did you have questions for our representatives?
Sure. And on the parking thing, I think we should probably get out of the business of setting parking rates from this dais. I think it may be a better idea to do it based on supply and demand at the beach, and kind of get the politics out of it, because I don't think anyone enjoys that. But the questions for the consultants that I have.
Duly noted.
Thank you. If our consultants can just help me understand some issues about working capital. So let's take a look, for example, at the general fund.
Okay.
The slide with all of that information, the control panel.
Sure. Jacob, can you pull that up?
Sure, yeah. I think my screen is no longer sharing. Let me do that again. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, so what I'm trying to get at, and help me out here, because I could be very wrong in my understanding of what working capital is. But working capital, those are your current assets, net of your current liabilities, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Well,
so
with the general fund though, we actually take, so we do it a little different, I guess, but we take what is in your statement of net assets as a summary. So fund balances, if you have the CAFR, but essentially it kind of works its way there. We do it a little different in the general fund, but what it truly includes is something called a subsequent year's budget, some unassigned fund balance, so about 3.9 million. And then I think if you might be alluding to the fact that we're showing about $9 million in there versus a CAFR that showed an assigned of 3.9. Is that where you're trying to get at? Sorry,
yeah,
might be jumping ahead.
Yeah. So there are two things. That is exactly the case. And in addition to that, I'm trying to, obviously our working capital balance is looking fantastic here. Some of that has to do with the fact that we've borrowed some money long and we've received cash, or are going to receive cash today. So the liability isn't current, but the cash we're receiving is cash, and will be counted as a current asset. So I'm trying to figure out the effects of the debt long-term on our city's financial position.
Yeah, so that's it exactly. So it's kind of a balance sheet, transaction, and you end up getting a little bit more into your cash, and then that same number is booked into your long-term liability. So in essence, it doesn't get accounted for in this working capital calculation.
Right.
But for this 2020 debt issuance that the city has now incurred, so through the end of the projection, through through the end of the time period in which it was borrowed for, so 2040, on average, the city will be paying $356,000 a year.
Okay. I very much appreciate that explanation, and we'll get back to the difference between what's actually there and what's there on paper. As far as difference between fund balance and other things. But can you help me contextualize or put into perspective the annual debt service? Our general fund budget increases by a certain amount every year based on how much our different sources of revenue increase. But in the context of how much our ad valorem revenue increased this year, which is a big thing that we look forward to every year, about what does that annual debt service mean?
Give me a second, I'm actually calculating.
Okay. And I'm sorry, it's a.
No, that's okay. So I just kind of did a quick math of what the percentage of that service is as it relates to the projected annual ad valorem. And in 2022, I guess it's about 2.9%. But of course, as your ad valorem starts to increase and your debt is kind of staying somewhat the same, that relationship is going to change slightly and get smaller.
I apologize. I was asking for a comparison between the annual debt service and not the total ad valorem, but the rate of change in ad valorem, right? So like we have an ad valorem base, we tax that, and then every year that changes because the taxable value increases.
Yep. So right now we're assuming on average for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years that your ad valorem is going to grow by about 7.3%. Historically, it's been a little bit higher than that. And the debt service is that the $360,000 that I mentioned, that's pretty steady. That's not going to change.
Right. So when you said that the debt service is about 2-ish% of ad valorem, were you talking about 2-ish% of the increase, the projected annual increase in ad valorem, or? Total
I'm just
ad
thinking the total ad valorem, but then if your ad valorem is growing at 7% and your debt service is staying around the same, that relationship is going to be smaller so that, 2 or 3% is going to come down to maybe 1, 2%. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
I guess.
what I'm really trying to get at, right, is
Yep.
the
Gotcha.
debt service in relation to the increase in ad valorem every year. So like whatever, like if debt service was $1 and our total ad valorem was 100, and we expected our ad valorem to increase by 1% every year, the debt service would be about 1 to 1.
Mhm.
And then compounding takes over, and the debt service relative to the increase decreases. I'm not interested in the debt service to the overall ad valorem, but to the debt service to the annual increase in ad valorem that we're projecting.
So Dave, I'm not sure if I understand this, but I
Why?
think, it's essentially the dollar change from one year to the next versus the
Yes.
debt.
Right. And I think the ad valorem's growing by about 2 million a year, I
Okay.
think. And so 300,000 on 2 million would be about 15%.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. That's all I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. And just in simplest terms, to address your earlier question, you are increasing your cash balance essentially by $5 million with that borrowing. And then long term, you're paying that $386,000 off. And so you're right in that the liability is not showing up in your working capital balance. Does that
okay?
make
All
sense?
right. And I guess, what I was trying to get at overall with both of these questions was trying to tease out the effect of the borrowing on our financials. That's kind of, what I'm trying to, and also trying to figure out, okay, yes, we borrowed this money. We borrowed it very long. We got really great rates, and it comes at an annual cost. And I'm trying to contextualize that annual cost to see how much of the expected gains in our tax base will that debt service erode. It doesn't appear to be very much. I mean, it looks like we're basically for the next year committing about 1/6 of what we expect to get in an increase to servicing this debt. And that seems to me to be a very decent deal, given the fact that we need the debt right now because of all that's going on in the world. I just don't want to, and I think Commissioner Robinson talks about this a lot. I think sometimes it's very easy to borrow money and not necessarily think hard about the long-term consequences of the borrowing on your finances, because you're trying to solve a problem today that we might solve by fiscal discipline in different ways. But I appreciate the work that y'all have done. This is a difficult year to be in government. I hope that we can build on the successes we were having prior to this year. This is, I don't know that the budget we're going to approve before October 1st is the budget that we may have wanted when the year started, but it's probably the budget that we're going to have to approve. So I appreciate y'all. And, on previous comments made by the chair, excuse me if I attempted to discuss with Ed a subject that, at least in the depth that I entered it, wasn't in the minds of the chair and the vice chair for this meeting relevant to this budget workshop. I was exploring a question that I think a lot of people in the community care about. And
we did have that discussion, and we're going to move on because I see Commissioner Robinson's hand is up. So Commissioner Robinson.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that, payback is a bitch, I've heard. But borrowing is good. And if we have the ability to pay it back, that's great. I just want Lake Worth Beach to be competitive, a desirable place to come to. And I want our budget to reflect the ability to provide amenities, quality of life, safety, a safe and desirable place to live based on our budget. I want people to want to come here and be knowing that they have a good, responsible budget. And we need to think about the amenities that we need to provide out of this budget, and the desirability that we need to create, and to be competitive, because people do have a choice of where to live. And I appreciate the work that all the staff has put into this. And I worry about not paying back a lot in 2021 when we kick it down we have a propensity to kick stuff down the road, and I think we should start paying a little sooner rather than later, even though it's tough. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you. I want to thank Stentech. Also, Clyde's on the call tonight. Thank you, Clyde. Quite often we don't get to hear from you, but thank you for all the hard work you do. And Bruce and all your staff, you've got some great new staff over there that are doing great work.
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Again, we haven't heard much from our Assistant City Manager. Thank you, Juan. I know you're working from home and doing a lot of behind the scenes. So I just want to thank everybody. City Manager, thank you very much. Are there any last minute comments? Anyone else need to mention anything? City Manager, you got anything?
Mr. Chairman?
And yes, City Manager, I see you. Bruce, you have your hand up.
Yes, sir. After the Stantec presentation, I would like a little bit of time to just give you a brief overview of the capital plan for the 5-year plan. So,
absolutely. I thought that was included because the way it's written on my agenda, but if we're finished with Stantec, go ahead.
All right. David, I thank you very much, Leticia and Jacob. Appreciate all the work you guys have done. Keith, if you could just put on the capital spreadsheet. You have received the attached spreadsheet along with the detailed project sheets that go with this. I just want to go over the schedule so that you understand it. I really didn't want to go down into the details tonight.
You're just going to do a broad overview, correct?
Yes, sir.
And everyone has this in their backup. I know it's kind of small, but you all have everything in your backup.
You should have everything in the backup, and then you should have the project sheets that go with it. So just to start, the schedules start with the governmental funds and the general fund in particular. This is a roll forward of the fiscal year 20 capital plan. So you may see projects that are listed in column A and B that were approved or otherwise presented in fiscal year 20. So again, it's a roll forward. The 20 plan went through 24. This schedule goes out through 25. Just to go through, if you look at column L, this is the beginning of fiscal year 21. The first column L is the revisions to a prior year. It could have gone up, down. So we want to capture that information relative to the total cost as it goes out. Any 21 requests that are new, the PAYGO and fund balance, these are important ones from PAYGO, which is current revenues. Fund balance is a special appropriation out of fund balance. So that they need to be made. Column P are transfers from other funds, grants, sales tax, new borrowing, and then the not funded. This is consistent from year over year. So we have 21, then column V starts 22, column AF 23, column AR 24, column 25. And then the last columns are the compilation or the summation for the 5-year total. It's not a 6-year total, it's a 5-year total. And then it's for each department, and then it goes down into the enterprise fund. So if you scroll down to row 239, you'll see the beginnings of the enterprise funds, the electric fund, then followed by water, et cetera, et cetera. Each project, again, has a project sheet. So if you have any questions relative to the different projects, that detail should be provided on those schedule, on that particular sheet. And then from there, it just provides that the detailed analysis that can be discussed during the authorization process. I'll be happy to go into any more detail if you wish, but I thought it would be best just to give you the opportunity to review it individually and then to come back with any questions or more detail that may be suited. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And I just want to remind all the commissioners that senior staff is always available if you have any questions or you need to update or be educated on certain issues. And quite often the questions you ask give them the ability to bring that information forward in these meetings, so they can actually answer the questions, you know, without a roundabout answer or shuffling to try to find it during a meeting. So please feel free to reach out to any of the senior staff. I see no hands up. City Manager, did you have anything?
I really want to thank Stantec as well, and Bruce and the finance team, all the department directors. The budget every year is a very arduous process. On a regular year, it's difficult. This year, I think one of the comments was said that this may not be the budget that we had hoped for at the beginning of 2020, but it's the one we're working with based on the realities of what we're facing. And I think that staff has risen to the challenge in presenting you with these numbers and bringing it forward. I want to thank them for that time, effort, and energy. And this is the biggest policy decision that you make every year is the budget. You have to pass the budget and deal with it. And I wish circumstances were better and more, we were in person and doing this in a normal environment, but I think everyone's done a great job here. And I want to compliment the staff and the consultants who have helped us get this far, and for your time and diligence in working with us on this as this goes into adoption next month. I also want to remind you that as we do the budget, we also are trying to meet the goals and objectives of our strategic plan. Some of these things that you're have approved and that we're moving forward with, such as the refinancing that occupied some of the conversation tonight. You know, frankly, that was a very shrewd set of transactions that I want to credit to Bruce and his team for bringing it forward in the way that he did and showing us that this was something that was possible. And, you know, in authorizing that we move forward to bring it to you, I felt very comfortable that this was something that was going to position this city in a much more stable financial manner. And I'm really pleased to see that happen as we move forward into the next phases of the borrowing for the electric utility. We hear you loud and clear that we want to make sure that we don't overextend ourselves. I think Commissioner Robinson said many times tonight, you know, worrying about the payback. Yes, we do. And those numbers are things that we're watching very closely to make sure that it's woven into the base of what we have with both debt coming off and our profitability. But at the end of the day, we need to see infill and refill occur in this city. If this is ever going to be a sustainable budget, if we're ever going to be able to do all the things we need to do, both in adjusting our rates in the marketplace, and also providing the services and programs, all these moving pieces have to work in concert with that goal in mind. And it has to be done in a sense that we're bringing new residents into the city, which goes back to building units. And we're starting to see a lot of success. I've talked to several of you individually. You've asked that there are a lot of interest among developers, both currently here and coming, that you're going to see coming before you potentially in redevelopment projects. We've set off in that there's really, unless you're willing to buy a restored cottage or an expensive waterfront property, the only thing available to people is pre-1985 houses that you have to spend several $100,000s to fix up. So there's a missing segment of the housing market there that we're hoping to see start to infill. These are things we've talked about over the 8 years, and it's starting to happen. So while things are very difficult now, this is a difficult budget, difficult process. We have built on successes to get to this point, and I'm very optimistic about the future for this city. Bear with us. Better days are ahead, and it starts with these budget processes and approvals, and I want to thank you so much.
Thank you, City Manager. Commissioner Robinson, did you have a closing comment?
I just, I don't think that we're supposed to be micromanaging, and I don't know how we negotiate things that really don't suit individuals in the budget. And I don't expect them to change because they've been presented in a whole package, which bothers me a little. When we're not in terrific times, and we seem to be spending a lot of money on smaller items that we would like to have, but we don't need. And I don't want to get into detail because I don't know that I don't know how we do it, because different commissioners are going to have different opinions, and I don't quite understand the system of priorities and how they're addressed. There's a lot in here that concerns me on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure how to handle it. If it's one-on-one, that doesn't quite seem to be the commission. I don't know how we do this on a group basis. I guess we do it on an individual basis, and then it's up to. I guess that's how it's done in terms of departments and commissioners. So I'm not real comfortable with it. Let me say that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardy, I see your hands up.
Sure. I'll just echo what Commissioner Robinson said, right? So obviously this is a very unique economic environment. It is a very steep recession. We don't know how long it'll be, but it's certainly very steep. And there are cities all around us, cities all across the United States that are making extremely difficult choices. And they are foregoing lots of things that they would love to do, especially on the capital spending side. They are asking themselves whether the things they thought were necessary yesterday are necessary today in light of scarcity of resources being a little different this year because of the economic environment that we're in. And maybe we're just smarter than all the other cities around us. Our solution seems to be, interest rates are very low. We can borrow, very long. And, we do not feel that the debt service annually that we're taking on will erode our margin of safety as far as the other increases that we'll have to absorb, whether that's salary, health insurance, and other things like that. That seems to be the bet that we're making, that we can take on this new expense of the debt service and continue to have all the other new expenses that we have every year, because operating a city isn't cheap. You got to pay people more. Everything costs more every year. And it could just be that we're just smarter than everybody, or it could just be that we want to avoid, and I'm not saying staff, I'm talking about from a policy perspective, and we're responsible for that we want to avoid some of the very, very, very difficult decisions about what we might have thought was necessary again last year that might not be this year, right? That's, I think, I don't want to put words in Commissioner Robinson's mouth, but when he spoke, that's kind of what I heard, that our solution was to just borrow and to kind of put off some of those very difficult choices. And borrowing isn't necessarily bad when interest rates are extremely low, and when the Fed signaled today that they have no problem, you know, continue to operate in this zero interest rate environment. So you know, I just hope that we're on the right side of the bet. That's all. And I appreciate the hard work that staff members do on our behalf. And on the one-on-one issues, I think we've had this discussion previously. You know, residents, lots of residents that I speak to really would like us to ask some of these questions in public because they want to see this stuff play out in public. It's not the same when it plays out in private and we come here all ready to go and just do whatever, you know, it was that we decided individually one-on-one, right? And that's not, you look, you know, we clearly have differing philosophies there. I think that a lot of these questions, even if you know the answers to them, should be asked out in public. And I think that we're all the better for it. So I appreciate the opportunity to make a final comment. I again appreciate the hard work that staff does. And again, you know, I hope that we're on the right side of this bet, and that the debt service, which is a new expense, won't be too much in addition to all the other new expenses that we're going to have in the future. And so again, I appreciate staff's savvy.
And my final comment would be, we have great staff. I trust that they are the professionals and they know what they're doing. And at no time did I suggest that we should be having conversations behind closed doors and not bringing it to the public. I suggested that the commission should always talk to staff to get their questions answered and then bring it here, and make sure that the information that you're bringing here is proper and right. Tonight, a couple times we heard staff being second guessed on numbers that may have come up in previous meetings. That's what I'm trying to get at, that, you know, the proper information. I don't expect you, me, or any of the staff to remember everything that's happened in 10 meetings before. You know, get with staff, get your questions answered, bring them to the public, and have the right information being pushed out. Bruce, did you have something you wanted to add? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, the issue about the debt. I just want to say that we took a lot of time working with Davenport, our financial advisors, and Stantec, and even our bond counsel to put the city in the best position. I would never recommend going out to bond activity or for activity that would create a structural deficit. Essentially, what you want to do is borrow for one-time expenditures, and not otherwise you are going to create a structural deficit, and your concerns would be definitely warranted. I think what we did, we took an opportunity to restructure the city's working capital, which is very, very important. And quite honestly, it gives us a lot of flexibility. And you see that flexibility in the working capital ratios as we move forward. And I think that, you know, that's very, very important. And remember, all those borrowings are across all funds. Not one fund is going to absorb any or that whole amount. I think,
Bruce, I want to thank you and your staff for thinking outside the box and making that happen. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.